I'll read out some of the names.
Well, we're live. Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Belaine from Point Reyes Books. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're so excited to be partnering with our good friends at Community Bookstore in Brooklyn and New Directions Publishing to present to you tonight Thalia Field and Anakana Schofield to discuss Thalia's new book, Personhood. And before I turn it over to them, I want to just give you sort of a quick rundown of how things will go. About 45 minutes into the event, we'll turn it over to your audience questions. So at any time during the event, feel free to put those questions in the Ask a Question tab at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them around that time. But at any point, feel free to do that. If you haven't bought the book yet, there's the glowing green Buy a Book button at the bottom of your screen. And I've also linked to communities, if you want to buy for them, in the chat for Anakana and Thalia's books there. And I also want to just let you know a bit about our upcoming events. On May 14th, we have Ricky Ducornet and Jeff Vandermeer. On May 25th, Sarah Davis and Hillary Leichter. And then on June 3rd, Susan Bernofsky with Kate Zambrino will be talking about her new book, On Clairvoyant of the Small, The Life of Robert Balser. And all these events are on our Crowdcast page, so you can follow our Crowdcast page if you want to keep up to date, or sign up for our newsletter, which I also put in the chat there. But without further ado, let me introduce our readers tonight. Anakana Schofield is an award-winning Irish-Canadian writer of fiction, essays, and literary criticism. Her novels include Malarkey and Martin John and Bina. The UK edition of Bina was shortlisted for the Goldsmiths Prize in 2020. Schofield lives in Vancouver, British Columbia. Tonight she'll be talking with Thalia Field. Thalia Field is an Adele Kellenberg-Seaver Professor of Creative Writing at Brown University. Her most recent novel is Experimental Animals, a reality fiction from Solid Objects Press. Her 3 New Directions books are Point and Line, Incarnate, and Bird Lover's Backyard. Tonight, they'll be discussing her new book, Personhood. So thank you both for joining us.
Thank you so much, Emily. Hello, Washington. I think you're Portland or Washington. And hello, Providence, Rhode Island. Hello, Thalia.
Hello.
It's great to see you. Congratulations. Hello, everybody. We've already got the first I love you from someone called Stephanie. Haters, don't type a message because I'm going to read it out. It's lovely to see you. Congratulations on your fabulous book. This is Personhood. This is Thalia's 8th book. And I was very blessed to discover your work using a technique I'd like to advise everybody watching to use if you haven't already used it. It's where you go and you find a publisher and you kind of like some of their books, and then you just go through the catalog and you basically order all their books and you discover Thalia. And that's how I discovered your work. And it's been a very enriching experience. So yeah, how's it going in Rhode Island?
It's good. Early spring. Yeah. Weird spring, but good. Yeah.
Okay, well, it's very warm today in Vancouver. It does tend to get warm here before it gets warm where you are. Oh, there's Solid Objects. Congratulations, Thalia. We love you, Solid Objects. Solid Objects is the publisher who put out Thalia's second to last book, Experimental Animals, a very phenomenal novel you'll need to discover if you haven't already discovered it. So, yeah, so I think what we'll do, should we start with a reading? Shall we?
Okay.
Yeah? Okay. So one of the things people should know about this book is all of the pieces are kind of like, they're almost like planets within a solar system, I would say. So it's wonderful because you can spend so much time with one piece. So what we're going to do is we're going to read this piece, Turns Before the Curtain. And we're going to read it together. We haven't rehearsed this, so if it's a disaster, we don't want to know. Do you want to say something about the piece before we read it?
No.
No? Okay.
It's a vaudeville. It's sort of a vaudeville about the so-called invasive species crisis.
Okay, so I'm reading bold, and Thalia's reading not bold in terms of the typeface, if you're following along at home. All right, you read the title.
All right, turns before the curtain. Tumbleweed.
An innocuous bramble cavorts on stage.
Plague, disaster, rampage. Biological pollution can't be reversed.
The audience giggles at the silly rolling.
Surprise! 10,000 interlocking tumbleweeds bounce aggressively up into the grid, up and beyond the set, up the aisles, choking the exits. It's high noon in the Old West.
No more giggles.
Tumbleweeds come from Eurasia.
Where is that? Why did they send these marauding carcasses here?
Clowns enter, a high kicking number, sending more tumbleweeds onto the audience.
Clowns!
Sunlight stretches across the drought-parched range where ranchers can't support their herds. No cattle eat the strange young plants who have ample room to spread out in the denuded soil. Why does no one eat these shoots?
A sudden rain and the happy plants reach their potential, tall as you please.
Come winter, the tall green dies back to brown. Frost and wind uproot the twisted spools who perambulate far and wide, clumping and romping and intertwining, blocking schools and roads and fences. Tumbleweeds seek adventure across all habitable and uninhabitable space. The windy season is for breaking loose and setting sail, for spreading more seed than can ever be counted. Ah, destiny.
Max.
So where is Europe? If you ask a fungus, maybe it starts in Moscow and travels westward at 41 kilometers a year. Maybe it reaches Sweden from its Asiatic origins.
Confused, clapping. Who cares where Europe is? It's everywhere and nowhere, so what?
But the fungus didn't start in Moscow. It started in Asia. Where is Asia? It is a continent of itself, but only by convention. Is a continent more or less a discrete landmass surrounded by water? What's a large island? Where is Asia and where is Europe? Is there a reason to cross from one to the other? Often it's left to the isthmus. Does this audience even think about Africa?
The first chemical reaction, the know-how of fire, spreads among early humans, just as human populations spread out of Africa, north and east and west, bringing combustion for cooking, space travel, and cars that passed tiny particles along arteries.
Someone yells fungi in the crowded theater. Fomites everywhere, an accumulation of home, nation, fashion, and custom, from Latin fomus, the word for tinder, the ignition for the contagion. Exiting things leave carbon scattered on stage, bones, wood, coal, lava. Plants tangle their breath, absorb radioactive carbon dioxide from the universe. Lumbering animals acquire it from eating the plants. Fat men in hats point to a star chart of possible Earths. Languages die. Fungi gain their own kingdom, like a bright royal palace apart from plants and animals, where growth is their main means of mobility, except for spores, which may travel through air or water. Mostly they live in soil or on things already dead.
Feral swine. Raucous horn section. Stampedes. Police at the exits. Everyone carries poison. After releasing pigs in New World forests, Europeans bring in wild boar to shoot as well.
Everyone is affected in some way. We can't just barbecue our way out. Feral piglets run down the aisles with youthful acrobatics. Their lack of natural predators makes them giddy. They are hybrids of hybrids, but if not all non-natives are invasive and not all invaders are non-native, what, for example, do we do with the bristly pig, descendant of escaped farm animals?
Don't be fooled. These cuties grow to 5 feet long and 3 feet high and weigh up to 250 pounds. Running up to 30 miles an hour, they have cloven devil hooves and skin that can withstand assault rifle shot from low-flying helicopters. Worse, they breed year-round, doubling their population in only 4 months.
A feral pig dies agonizingly slowly from a gunshot, while others, wallowing, pollute springs and ponds and alter stream beds and habitat because no one wallows who doesn't also root. Put more bounty on feral hogs. It doesn't stop their families spreading like wildfire across state lines, carrying disease, damaging crops, and eating endangered species, not to mention whole pig clans tearing up archaeological sites.
Archaeological sites?
Denmark builds a 70-kilometer fence along its border with Germany. Will the pigs stop crossing? Will African swine fever, which has been found in 2 dead boar in Belgium, threaten Denmark's huge pig industry? Feral removal programs include aerial hunting, surveillance, and cage and corral traps. In America, the feral pig population grows from 1 million to 6 million across 38 states.
A pig runs past the curtain, escapee from a farm. Another tiptoes in from a hunting preserve. They feed on endangered birds' eggs, young lambs, crops, snakes, and ladies' hats. Always on the move, they split up to protect their babies, jumping fences, swimming across lakes, cutting through fields, hiding along riverbanks, diverting attention to escape the dogs and night hunts.
The government enters with a plan. Warfarin, sold as kaput feral hog bait, will poison them and, bonus, turn their insides blue to warn hunters not to cook them for dinner.
If you want them gone, this will get them gone.
In a part of Australia, warfarin eliminates 99% of feral pigs in a few months, but immobilized pigs bleeding from their eyes and dying for weeks in helpless pain bring too much outcry, and the poison is phased out in favor of the low-flying helicopters and assault rifles.
Should we stop at the word United Nations? Or should we keep going?
Well,
what do you think?
That's good.
What do you think? What are you feeling?
That's
You
good.
want to dive into the UN?
No, that's fine.
So this piece, it just maps so much. It goes all over the place. It's wonderfully theatrical. It's so ludic. It's so playful, and it's so beautifully written. This entire book seems to be a combination of a call to arms and an indictment. Can you talk a little bit about what it sprung from?
Yeah,
aside from the 3 other books you wrote on this topic.
Right. So this is sort of the 3rd book in a series, a sequence of questions I was interested in about how we are so entangled, our relationship with our animal relatives. We are so entangled in these narratives that, to me, really trap us in very bad behavior. And I was very curious about why are we actors in this horrible, endless sort of tragic comedy, and so I'm always interested in trying to find the stories that are at the root of the problem in a certain way. And I think when we inherit certain kinds of narratives, whether it's from science or psychology or wherever the narratives are coming from, even myth or religion, we end up really in trouble in our relationships, and we end up as actors in life. We act out the stories, and so I've been interested in, particularly in Personhood, in the legal stories, the stories that have to do with regulations and laws, and A Bird Lover's Backyard was very interested in sort of definitional stories of species, and Personhood is very much questions about our relationship to especially wild animals and how we entrap and confuse the matter by bringing them, by confusing issues of whose home is it, who's a guest in that home, and what the stories are that determine our behavior there.
So what are the narratives that you really hate? Let's just start there. Like, what are the ones that you like? Can you identify the ones that you truly are pushing back against?
Well, in this book, I think I'm particularly exploring ways that we justify through storytelling keeping captive animals caged up in one form or another, and whether that's caged up figuratively, literally, or imaginatively. I think we trap animals that are non-domesticated in stories that are incredibly detrimental to their well-being. And we center ourselves in those stories in ways that are incredibly narcissistic. And I think that, ultimately, I'm so interested in narrative, but it's a narrative problem.
Right. So I'm just curious, right? Because the first piece in the book, Hi Adam, gives us this voice, and it's clearly a parrot, and it's, as you say, it's polyphonic, but that echo of Adam, the first protagonist, if you like, that we meet, echoes throughout the book. What's fascinating to me about this book is the way that every single piece has a different form. They're not repeated. They may be picking up from earlier pieces that you had in other books, but they're not actually repeated. And then each form is almost hermetic. And as you read it, it teaches you how to read it. The form kind of begins to tell itself. So I was curious about how you came to that echo of the parrot.
Well, so there's multiple echoes there. In Bird Lovers, I have a piece about the philosopher and poet Vicky Hearn, who I had the privilege of working with. She was extremely influential to me as a young person. And she wrote a book called Adam's Task. And so it's about the relationship we have to command and training to domestic animals, in her case. I volunteered for a number of years at a parrot sanctuary here in Rhode Island. And there was a parrot named Adam who said, "Hi, Adam," all day long. And in fact, all the parrots said, "Hi, Adam." And I was so fascinated by the fact that the parrot said its own name to you, to say hi to you, as an immediate call to you to reflect back to it your presence and its presence. It was an incredibly moving experience for me, to work with the birds, who are these captive parrots mostly, and to get involved with their stories and how, in fact, a sanctuary is highly endeavoring to recreate a story for these birds. These birds live trapped in our stories about them. And a sanctuary is sort of endeavoring to pull that apart slowly but surely. So through my experience with Adam and the other birds, I started to write that piece.
And then within the sanctuary, can you tell us a little bit more about that? There's a degree of theatricality in the way that, I don't know, I've never been to a parrot sanctuary. I've just watched parrot videos on YouTube, and I'm probably, after reading this book, never going to watch another parrot video on YouTube. I'm probably going to atone for the many, many long hours I spent admiring captive parrots.
Yeah.
And also getting kind of a little cheesed off because not all parrots have talents. And if your parrot doesn't have a special talent, please don't make a 32-minute video on YouTube without there being, I've watched so many parrot videos waiting for them to, do tricks or speak Shakespeare. And now, of course, I realize, having read this book, that I'm the big part of the problem. This lust that we have for animals. And probably the pandemic hasn't been good to us in that way. I've certainly become a bit obsessed with donkeys, to the point where, I'm almost transforming into a bit of a donkey, to be honest. But yeah, so I really want to know more about, I hear the voice of Adam, the parrot, and I also, of course, hear the voice of Adam and Eve, and Adam Bede, and, all these Adams, the endless atom of Adam. But I want to know about what it was to be in that space with what would have been, I don't know how many birds, and whether that, because were you alone with those birds? And was it almost a theatrical space in many ways, because they were all inside these enclosures performing for each other or not?
Yeah, they're all performing. Sadly, a lot of them are performing for you. This is the tragedy, the common tragedy of the captive wild animal, especially these parrots, is that they bond to humans in a very destructive way. And the stories of their bonding it just ends in horrible devastation and erotic behavior and terrible self-immolating, self-destructive behavior on the part of the birds. So it's a little bit, as I say in the piece, it's like it's a convalescent home. It's an old age home. You know, birds live 100 years. So most of them are our age, you know, and they've only just begun, and they're stuck, you know, they're basically homeless, stateless refugees of having no connection to their usual environment. And many haven't. They were stolen. You know, it's one thing to adopt dogs and cats. I'm all for saving, you know, domestic animals, but wild animals should not be in, they shouldn't be in our homes. It makes no sense to them. And I mean, in the semiotic world building sense, like it can't register. And so they're trapped in a story that's not their story on any level, and they lose their relationships. So it's, you know, there were hundreds of birds there. It's an incredible place. Foster parrots. They recently had a fire. I mean, this is the terrible news of that story, is that since I've written it, every single cockatoo, over 60 cockatoos have died. There was a fire in the sanctuary, and only one cockatoo survived. Buddy, who's not in that, he's not mentioned by name in the story, but so it's been a devastating few weeks. Actually, that was a few weeks ago. But you know, but the macaws are okay. There's the 300 or 400 birds at the sanctuary, and so the fire was located in the wing that I worked in, which was mostly the cockatoos. And it was in the wall, and it was not anyone's fault. And they saved the rest of the birds, but it was an incredible tragedy. So that's weighing on me a bit, because of course I wrote the piece not thinking it would be a eulogy of any kind. And so you know, but the birds are theatrical. I mean, they're performers. They're performers, and I tried to capture that in the piece. You're in an incredibly lively situation with complex, autonomous beings who don't need to be locked up in cages or put in people's homes. So,
especially given, certainly I didn't realize how long parrots live. I mean, they live so long; they're going to outlive the average human if you're lucky. You know, you might get 70 years if you're, you know, if you're in the cholesterol club like I am. Probably got 5 more minutes, but yeah, I don't think people realize that. Well, at least I didn't realize it. Now, I'm also really curious about this question of a book aging into the world. So you wrote this book, and I should say, like, this book is so rich. You know, it's like our favorite books. It's deep, it's complex. It requires you to sit with it and read it closely, and it's so rewarding when you do, because it's just rich. That's the only word for it. And it does betray your deep curiosity, and your curiosity is so wide, and it, you know, the continuum of your curiosity is fascinating, because it goes back so far and it considers the future. So I'm just, what was my point? I'm just curious about the experience of this book now coming into a pandemic world, because I'm assuming when you wrote this book, we weren't, you know, the wet markets were not the you know, mares, the camels, the viruses were not like on everybody's, you know, just like the way they are now since SARS-CoV-2. So I'm just curious about what it is to have written a book that is so timely and urgent, and like I say, there is this interesting legal thing in it. It does read like an indictment, and then the reader comes to it, and there are, in a few of the pieces, especially true crime, nature fakers, you use this technique where the reader has to respond, and in that response, you're forming a defense. You know, it's not a conscious defense, but as you read the piece, you realize how lacking you are in information or knowledge. Like, for example, I was going to give a little example of what I'm talking about, because Thalia uses really interesting experimental literary devices that create such a different perspective for the reader. So you're indicted into it without realizing you're indicted into it, in a way that you're not just spectating. It's not a manifesto. It's not didactic. So, you know, consider if, and then there's a bracket, definition house is not the same as, and there's brackets, 5 synonyms for house, or any of the 6 words used for the living spaces of animals. And it goes on and on. Consider 4 signs of drought. And as a reader, you try to pick out visual images, and sometimes you only have 2 or 1. And I don't know, this is just from a reading point of view. And perhaps in the writing of it, that was not your intention. And perhaps I will be the single reader to have this experience, but that's what's so beautiful about reading, right? The reader comes, completes it, and every time it's different. But I was very interested in the way that legal, it is. It's the indictment, and the reader comes and inadvertently tries to form a defense and realizes there is no defense. We are lacking a defense. So anyway, I have no actual question.
That's a really great way of thinking about it. Actually, I've never thought about it quite that way. That there is a legal theme going through. The second piece in the book is, about I wrote it actually for the Non-Human Rights Project, their case about the elephant Happy, who I'd gone to several protests for, and actually the good news, so the bad news on the parrots gets a little bit balanced by the good news that Happy's case was just taken up by the New York Court of Appeals in the Habeas Corpus case. So the piece is called Happy That You Have the Body, the Mirror Test, and Happy is the first elephant to have passed this mirror test. So the piece is kind of about how we, again, narrate versions of personhood and how, where we distribute this out and how we decide who has what, and that piece really is about the legal concept of habeas corpus, which has an interesting history and how it's entangled now animals.
So what does that mean for Happy? Because Happy is an animal. He's an elephant, or she's an elephant. I can't remember if it's a he or she.
At the Bronx Zoo, where she's been in solitary confinement for over 40 years. I mean, it's a tragedy.
And so what does the legal victory mean for her?
That the habeas corpus case is being heard at the Court of Appeals level on behalf of someone who's not a human. Now, the legal history of habeas corpus, it used to be just white people. I mean, it's, the history of habeas corpus is quite a radical and fascinating history, and I go into that in the piece. But this is the first time in an English-speaking court that a non-human animal will be given the privilege of a hearing on this, which is to release the body. You can't hold somebody without a reason. And so it requires some storytelling around, well, what's an autonomous creature? What does it mean to be a person?
Okay.
There's critiques of the concept of personhood because it is so narcissistic, but I'm using it in this book because it is the current concept that is being talked about. But the piece that you're talking about is also another legal, it's sort of a legal, it sort of branches off the legal question of criminality, trespass, and it brings up the questions of like 19th century naturalism, about the beast within, how we sort of criminalize ourselves almost. We see ourselves, we can't separate. It's like this projection. Again, it sort of mirrors and echoes and Narcissus, how we get trapped in our own narrative projections around who is even the criminal and who's trespassing and who has the right to live where we live. And so that piece is also echoes and continues the same kind of legal conversation. The prompts that you're referring to came from my old work in theater, where I developed that technique as a kind of improvisational form because I really like to hear the thinking mind of actors on stage. And so exactly what you're describing as the reader, that's what the actors would do, is come up with different things that they thought of every night. And so there was a collaborative enterprise. The writing is collective. And I was very interested in that kind of collective authorship. And so it isn't just, and so I love what you were saying about it being a defense, because we have to put ourselves in the story in some way to understand it. And that's, I guess, a lot of what I'm reaching for with these techniques.
It's so different because, there's been a lot of sort of personal and confessional essay writing, and that requires the reader to identify, to find themselves in a piece of writing. And what's so curious about the question, say, of animal rights, well, I can abdicate because I can say, well, I'm not personally holding the key to keeping Happy locked up, right? Like I can say, well, I've never bought a parrot, or I can say, well, I'm really sorry for, those pigs getting stunned right now. I just won't eat bacon on the pizza. But what's fascinating about this, of course, is I can't abdicate, right? I'm implicated as I read, because you get into my brain and you know, literally kind of like a farmer moving manure. You know, you move the manure out of my brain until I go, oh God, I did parrots. I looked at parrots on YouTube, or I don't even know what the signs of drought really are. I really think it's wonderful. And it's so interesting the way you do it with factual information, because you're collaging all of these sources, and you're a great woman for coming up with like antiquity and sources. I mean, experimental animals had so much source material. Can you talk a little bit to us about that research process that you must do? I mean, I want to understand Thalia Field, you know, Tuesday afternoon, you know, rummaging around in the legal briefs of the high courts in Pakistan, or 4th century Chinese philosophy, or, I mean, it's just so broad. I want to know, like, how you work. I mean, do you bump into things? Do you go in search of things?
Yeah, that's a good question. I both, I guess. You know, these pieces take me years to write, so they don't happen quickly. The forms that they're in don't happen right away. You know, the things, and also pieces almost organic. They blend, they come apart. It's like mitosis or something. Like some pieces were joined with other pieces at one point, and then I realized it's actually two different kind of threads of thought and story. So and in fact, Bird Lover's Backyard was written and published before Experimental Animals, because I was doing so much work, and I realized I had a whole other book's worth of work to get off the table before I could really tackle what was a very difficult book, Experimental Animals. It was just emotionally hard to work with vivisection as a concept and as a practice. And so,
but it's stunning that you say they take so much time, because of course I've always thought this about your prose. It's like 80 strength scotch, and you know, there's just no lazy writing in it. It's just like, it's like perfect embroidery or something. You know, as a writer, of course, we're reading, and of course we're reading towards what we want to write. And that's one of the things I love about your prose. I mean, just your relationship with language is extraordinary, but above and beyond that, it's also brilliant. Like, it's not lazy. So, I mean, I think that's very hopeful for anybody listening who's writing, because I think that you are very, very prolific. So it seems to me you just hiccup and, you know, come out with a book. So it's great to hear that that's not the case.
No, I mean, you know, Experimental Animals took 17 years and a lot, and I translated all of it from French, and then had to, you know, it was 900 pages at one point. I mean, that's the thing about language. The language, that has to be the seduction. I mean, I feel like the surface of the language and the comedy, to me, the comedy of things has to be the way in. It can't be ideas. I'm not interested in the ideas for themselves. I really want to retell how we think about these stories. And also you kind of do this interesting thing where you conduct, like, within your own piece. Like, there are very few writers who work this way. It's completely unique. So you conduct within your own piece. It reminds me a little bit of when I was writing Vina. You know, I wanted to get this. I really love that documentary voice, and that sense of distance. But like we're examining the way that documentary examines animals, like, you know, the green-bellied bumblebee or whatever. Note how she moves towards the yellow, you know, the yellow one-horned giraffe, and, you know, and and I love this idea of us appropriating that to the humans, that perhaps somehow the madness that is the human, like, needs to be kind of examined in this distanced, microscopic kind of way. Although I must admit, I was watching this fabulous
talk with Marilyn Robinson the other day, and she has like better thoughts about the humans than I have. And, you know, I was very chastened after listening to her Calvinist incantations. And then not long after that, I got a fever. And then I got sick, and I was like, you know what? I'm going back to pessimism.
Well, your work is also extremely, I mean, when we connected and I read your work, I was so entranced by its orality. I mean, I'm a very, very oral performative writer. Everything I hear, I ever see everything as though it's kind of staged. And I felt like the similar sense of performance in your books. I mean, Bina, obviously, but also even Martin John, which I think is just so brilliant. And you are very brave in your presentation of situations. And that's another thing that I really, I'm interested by, which is not just sort of the storyline and plot, which I kind of don't have any much interest in, but I loved how you also create a real situation of people, and it's complex, and you can't figure out who's starting and stopping actions or things. And and also you have a great attention to how people delude themselves through what we say. But that we both veil and reveal ourselves through language, which is,
I think that might be a cultural thing.
Well,
Irish Catholic culture is very good at saying, "It's great to see you. I never want to see you again in my life." How quick can it get away from you? Oh, right. You look great. Oh God. Yeah, I mean, let's talk a bit about that difference between story and situation, because you know, this is something that writers like yourself and myself, and I just want to say, you know, if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't have those books. Definitely Martin John and definitely Bina. So, you know, just so people know, like Thalia is a very, very, very generous confidant and colleague. And I definitely wouldn't have managed to write those books without your extraordinary support and encouragement. And lucky the students who get to learn from you as well. But let's talk about story for a moment, because, you know, I was once on a panel where the conversation, I was talking about style. And the conversation became whether or not one of the panelists felt that story might have been being used as a pejorative. And I do have a problem to some extent with the overemphasis on story. So I'd love to hear from you on that. What you got?
Well, I have so much, but I have a piece in this book about the irrationality of situations, which I find to be quite an irrational feeling. When I really start to learn about something, I feel completely overwhelmed and confronted by chaos and the irrational. And I'm like, why is that so troubling? And I think it's because we grew up in this very patriarchal sense that stories should be linear. So it makes me think of Ursula Le Guin's completely amazing piece on like the carrier bag theory of fiction, where like it's sort of like it should be a bag, not a spear. Like in it, she goes all the way back and sort of looks at ancient people, and it's a very funny piece. But that it shouldn't, that we to have answers isn't the point. And it's really the thing that I if I start to answer anything in a piece, I start to reject the piece. It's almost like I can't write it anymore. And I think it's a sense of inquiry that explores a situation, and it's just trying to be as honest and kind of and confronted with absurdity as you can over the fact that a situation, the geometry of a situation is not the geometry we've inherited from like a objectionist science. And so I think, so it's that's why I work a lot with the history of science, because I feel like the root of a lot of our confusion comes from the kind of narrative structures that we inherit from, now, not all science, and I'm not an anti-science person, I just want to make that clear in this day and age.
I wonder, it just occurred to me as I was thinking about this, because I've got a philosophical objection to endings, and I'm starting to realize it might be because of the crucifixion. Like, do you know what I mean? It was so terminal to grow up with that image that, you know, he ended up on the cross. And so it just occurs to me, because that's like a very formative narrative for me as a Catholic, somewhat like lapsed and, more of a part-time Catholic. But it just occurs to me, well, it's true, because story in its sort of classic form demands a beginning, a middle, and an end. But life doesn't really represent anything of the lived experience, because as we know, things tend to stop and start. Do you know what I mean? And so I don't really understand, because the ending, anyway, I just object to endings. And I think it's maybe death anxiety, but I don't want any more endings. I just want springboards. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of curious though, like, why has that become the prevailing demand? I mean, you know, in all its forms. I mean, it's really interesting, because if you look historically, there were episodes, right? It was episodic, and you never knew what was coming, and you didn't read. I guess in the 19th century, you didn't read a whole book at once, right? You got one episode, and then you got another episode, and anyway, I don't really know what the point is.
To me, it's tied into the human centrism of our narrative structures. We are the heroes of our stories. It has to be a human-sized narrative. Time and space are human-sized. We don't think about time and other dimensions, other temporalities. We don't stop a story until like a plant grows or a bird hatches. We don't. It's not like things are temporally. It's the unit set. It's we inherited it from naturalism, and I'm not a literary scholar, so. But it's true that when I worked in the 19th century in that book, I could see not only the origins of the science sort of narrative, but also the literary narrative, which is also a big part of the book, and how the arguments around literary form, we've also inherited the echoes of that. So it's a complicated question. I just think, that it is the inquiry. It is the springboard. It's what are the questions that we need to ask, and who are all the voices talking? And the silent ones in particular, I've always been interested the most in the voices that we do, the animals and a lot of women's stories and things that are not included when we're discussing, well, even what is life? What is life? Like, you ask a simple question, it's not simple, and then you're overwhelmed by a situation of answers that you have to. That to me, that's the pleasure of how we can use story, which is really to exhaust story. It's almost like we can use it to get to an end where it falls apart, and that's where I feel like things start for me.
And you've done the ultimate thing, because you've gone back and you've given, and in that novel, you've given the story of Fanny Bernard. Did I get her name right? It's been a while. Yeah. Like there's that you've given her story, which of course she never featured compared to himself, right? Now we've got a couple of questions, which are probably very insightful. Let's see. Okay, this is a long question. Okay, this question from Mr. Jeremy or Jeremy H. Not gonna say whether they're male or female or non-binary. Zooming out a bit. I was wondering about personhood in the context of the long history of American environmental literature. Thoreau, Muir, Carson. I have to tell you, Jeremy H., could we just leave Thoreau out of it? Let's go with Muir and Carson. I'm so bored with Thoreau. And those inspired by them. To what extent do you feel your book intersects with this genre? Where does it diverge? What mark do you hope it leaves on literature about the world beyond humanity? Okay, the other question you can choose if you don't want to answer both of them. The other question so far is from Carrie Weil. So are new stories the remedy for the ongoing stories in which we've been entrapped? What a great question.
So you have to go slower. I didn't hear that one.
Sorry. Okay, let's start with the first one. Okay. Are you influenced by American environmental literature and those who've inspired by them? To what extent does your book intersect? Where does it diverge? And what mark do you hope it leaves on literature about the world beyond humanity?
Yes. I mean, I'm not an academic, so I'm always a little aware that I come from everything from a pretty idiosyncratic place. But I have a piece in this book of Personhood. I actually have a piece called The Health of My Stream, or The Most Pathetic Fallacy. And that piece is really, in some ways, a critique of nature writing, because it's about the kind of the pathetic fallacy as a means to inhabit the other. and how we don't use our own story, we use nature to often tell our story. And so I overtly do a very pathetic thing. With
it's so good. It's one of my. I just discovered that piece this afternoon.
But that's a kind of relationship I have. I mean, I use the kind of the history of a lot of environmental literature. It kind of comes through in a lot of ways. I am a little more focused on animal subjectivity and how that's and how that reflects in our literature. Than the sort of, although even in the happy piece, a lot of the things that have gained personhood legally are things like rivers in New Zealand and rivers in India. And so I talk about those because that's a pretty extraordinary statement that natural phenomena can themselves represent a person. And so, I mean, obviously in America, if a corporation can be a person, why not a river? And certainly why not an elephant? But, but it shows the expansiveness of these concepts when we allow the stories to grow. And so, yes, I very much feel like I think I'm doing something different in narrative than a lot of environmental literature. So I would really love to be in that conversation. It's not kind of the only one I'm in, but I really feel like
your tools are literary tools. You know, whereas like naturalist writing, because I was actually thinking about that, like there's staging in the work rather than setting. Like you don't, in this book about the stream, you don't paint beautiful, tableaus describing things. It's much more physical. It's much more tactile. It felt like a memoir piece or a personal essay.
That's because in some ways I'm critiquing that form. I don't tend to write things personally, but I use that because I wanted to talk about the pathetic fallacy.
So did you actually invent all that stuff about those fish?
No, it's a real story. And in fact, as I was living it, I thought this is a perfect example of the pathetic fallacy. If I was a different kind of writer, I would write this piece exactly the kind of way, except now I've kind of ironized it. But the other
thing, beautiful. I just was so seduced by it.
Well, right. And I mean, it really is. I mean, I think there's a genre issue with environmental writing that I feel I do critique. I mean, like even we stopped reading right before the United Nations section of that piece, but the voice of authority that comes in from the scientists on environmental questions, I'm very interested in how we incorporate authority into our narratives and who we give it over to and where we lose kind of our own experience. So all of these questions, yes, I mean, I've been influenced by like Neil Laverne. I mean, there's a lot of people I really like the concept of weediness, and early on, when I was really beginning to read into all this, I don't know if I answered that question. What's the next question?
The next question is, there's 3 questions now. Hold on. So I have to close it because otherwise I can't see you.
What?
Oh, okay. This is a good question from Maya.
What's Carrie's question?
Carrie says, so are new stories the remedy for the ongoing stories in which we've been entrapped? And then she follows up by saying, okay, I think you just answered this describing stories that exhaust themselves. Okay, and then there's another new question after that, which I'll save until you've answered Carrie's question.
Yeah, I think it's both about stories for voices that get suppressed in some, the voices of the that are there, but we don't listen. I mean, I think we don't listen a lot when we're starring in our story. When we're on stage in the spotlight, being in the center of everything, the last thing we can do is listen. And so that question of listening, allowing space for other things to emerge, that's definitely new stories, but that's simultaneously wed to new forms of stories that decenter the human heroic narrative and become a different kind of narrative exhaustion that allows really a new awareness. And I don't mean personal awareness. I had a very interesting conversation. I don't mean like, you have some epiphany, or if we do these things, we raise awareness. I don't mean it in that kind of terrible, boring way. I mean situational awareness, that we really see ourselves as part of something that is chaotic and irrational, that we don't understand and that has a mystery at the center of it. And we have to be okay with that mystery. And that mystery drives our inquiry about stories. So it's to me, that's the new kind of story that I think we need to engage in.
I mean, it's curious because there is this new kind of epidemic of instructionals that tell you sort of how to do fairly obvious things that you already know how to do. So I'm kind of curious if that could be appropriated in terms of animal rights, right? Like there are all those YouTube videos where they show you how to like pack a suitcase. Like, I mean, I know people, I happen to enjoy that genre, but you know, there is this sense of, and I think that's what I really loved about that fish piece. You know, the idea that you'd be going through all this consternation trying to fight to get these fish. And I love the way the neighbor says, no, the fish can't get up there. And then the fish turn out to not be trout, but to be chub. Like, what a great word. I mean, chub. I mean, the only last person I heard of was Chubbs the alligator, who was that 18-foot alligator wandering across the golf course in Florida, who frankly, I think was about to save humanity in like 4 nights. But so I love this, you know, that Chubb somehow, it was almost like a religious experience you were having.
Exactly.
Why not? And then I loved how at the end of the piece, you put in that tiny little sentence as an afterthought of what if I had this, you know, personal travesty. So you don't start by going, my personal travesty, I wondered if there was a fish, right? The fish are gone. Oh, I loved it. I'm sorry.
Right. What's the next question?
I think I actually entirely missed the point of what that story was trying to do.
What's the next question?
Okay, well, you know what? Actually, okay. Where do you find hope in this work? Good question.
When I don't know. I have no idea. I mean, I find hope because there are so many people doing such amazing work in this area. And so I mean, that's like things like the news about Happy, or the people who work day in and day out on behalf of those birds, those abandoned birds. You know, it's really, to me, that fact that we don't sing the songs of the people who do the labor to care and who really sacrifice their own comfort for the sake of telling a story a different way. And there are lots of those people telling a story a different way. So to me, that's the hope. The hope is that there are lots of people who would say, I don't buy that old story. We're going to tell it a different way now. So I'm just doing my part in some ways to kind of elevate those voices out there, talk about the same, you know, bring these stories in my little tiny corner of the universe to say these are stories a different way. But there are lots of people doing that. So that's my hope, is that I don't even need it as a hope. It's happening. There are lots of people doing it. So
it's not a tiny corner.
It's a pretty tiny corner.
Sectional, environmentally friendly, non-flammable couch.
So you brought up the fact that how do we grow into books and stuff. So I just wanted to say one thing that's sort of interesting is that, so the Happy piece I had worked on with the Non-Human Rights Project. And then, of course, there was the lockdown, and that piece, you know, the book is a lot about captivity and wild animals in captivity. I don't think there's any comparison to people in their houses and wild animal in captivity. Just so you know, that's not a comparison to me. But it was interesting. So I added one little quote into that Happy piece because in April, I'm just going to read this one section that I added in. When you talked about how to grow into it, how does the book grow with the times? So in April 2020, the Chief Justice of the Islamabad High Court determined that animals have natural and legal rights. This is a huge event that happened in Pakistan, and ordered a solitary elephant, Kavan, freed from the Margazar Zoo. In contemplating the pandemic in which we find ourselves, he writes, has nature forced the human race to go into captivity so as to make it realize its dependence for survival on other beings possessed with a similar gift, i.e. life? So that was that was one of the developments that happened on behalf of an elephant. But it was interesting that the judge at the highest court in Pakistan made the comparison himself. So I'm
just curious as well about process. like, as I'm listening to you talking, I realize, like, these stories, you're very driven to tell stories in a different way, different stories. And, you're with this book, they're laced around the plight of the captive wild. But broadly, like, I'd like to know more about you, language, writing, like, did you write as a small child? Were you somebody that really loved George Orwell's Animal Farm? Like, I want to understand a little bit. I mean, because, we've got like all these animals, but we've also got language. We've also got theater. We've also got art. And I'm kind of curious. I'd just like to know a little bit more about, like, where you struck upon it. Paddington? Winnie the Pooh?
No, I didn't. This is going to sound entirely weird, but I really didn't grow up as a reader. Right. Or even with books. I really was a kid. I was that kid in the theater. I was a theater rat. I sat in the back in the dark, and that was my happy place. All I wanted to do was be in theaters. I didn't even want to be outside. I just wanted to be in a theater, rehearsing something, putting something on. It was truly my first love and passion. And so that the orality, the whole atmosphere of theater has probably done more than anything else and when I came to writing books, I didn't know really much about it. And that's, I think, pretty obvious in my first few books. I just did what I felt like I wanted, and I brought my own take on everything. So, but the question at a more heart level is, I grew up in circumstances where I felt like I was at the mercy of a lot of other people's stories. And that was very educational. I realized the power, how you become an actor in someone else's story. That's not a joke. That's really real. And we're in the layers and layers and layers of ways we are forced to play out because someone else is telling us a story. That was very, very apparent to me. And my silence, and the idea that you have to be silent within that role is something that has translated to my commitment and to the ethics of revealing those silences, or at least acknowledging that they're there. And so I don't feel like I want to speak for the silence, but I want to very much make that clear. So my early books were a little bit more about the self, like the sense of a self being externally defined. They were a little more a bit about the silence of the self in a certain kind of way. And then I became, as I grew up a bit in terms of as a writer, I think I've really expanded the silence, who's silent and why, and how to engage that silence productively.
Do you think we ever, though, escape those narratives? Like, as writers, are we writing our way out of the narratives that ultimately will never, ever escape? Because I always think, for example, like when you look at a photograph of, say, immediate family, like, that you're never, ever, sometimes within families, you'll never become more than the 8-year-old you always were. Right. It doesn't matter. You're 72, but you're still in the memory of your sibling or whatever. You're still that 8-year-old in the brown sandals with the red balloon. So I'm kind of curious about that. Like, do we ever, is that what makes writers write? Why? I mean, at the end of the day, it's a fairly futile. We know it's a pretty futile, enterprise.
Well, so I think of the temporality of theater. I mean, time only goes really one way in some ways, and as artists, especially as writers, with a book as our form, we're invested in a kind of temporality, and so I'm interested in how you break out that temporality. I mean, your books, for example, where there's malarkey and then it spins out these other, like, that to me is a very temporally rich process, because we're going back and forth between the books themselves. The stories they're not closed. And that, to me, I mean, the fact that you do that is also, and there's so much orality and performance in your work. To me, it feels like that's also coming from that same, I mean, it's a little like Stein's ideas about performance, which really infused the way she treated the page. She's a hero of mine for that reason. I think she really got what it was to perform. She was also, of course, fascinated by names. And so, I use some of her work a lot in a book a prank of George's that I wrote with Abigail Lang. We really look at naming. So naming, because naming is exactly that thing. It's like somebody gives it to you and then you have it and then you play it out. But is it yours? Like whose name is it? And that's so that names are a very interesting place for me.
Yeah, and does it fit, right? And if it doesn't fit, and if it's itchy, how do you throw it off, right? Yeah, I mean, it's curious because it's true. Like those books that I wrote, they're a bit, in some ways, they have a kind of a bit like mushrooms or something. I didn't anticipate that I would write a book about Martin John. I mean, he's just Beirut. He was just a footnote. It's just self-provocation. If anything, I thought I'd write a novel about Bina. And then Martin John came out, and then he turned into this like pretty monstrous person, and yet pretty ordinary. I mean, he's us, right? He's not. That's who we are. Unfortunately, sorry to inform everybody. That we are precisely who Martin John is. He's we know him. He's sitting on the bus beside you. You may be him in some corner of yourself. So yes, it's curious the way that it unfolds, almost like planets within planets within planets. And yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm just really curious about this question, and I hope this isn't boring for the people who are watching, who we're really, really happy that you're still with us. I hate if this gets too kind of writerly, but like this question of carrying on. And in fact, forgotten there's 5 questions. Jesus Christ. Who was it? Maya, who asked that question about hope? Like this question of carrying on, like how do you carry on, whether you're reading, whether you're writing, how do you carry on living? How do you carry on living with the tragedy of the parrots? Like there are so many reasons kind of not to. Okay, sorry, that was a bit depressing. Okay, sorry.
Well, they're rebuilding, and every day there's calls coming from people who can't keep their parrots. I mean, that's how you go on. There's more and more parrots who need a place like that to go. There's nowhere for these birds to go. And the care that they need is extraordinary. So if anyone wants to learn more, to go to fosterparrots.com. It's one of the biggest bird sanctuaries in the Northeast. In fact, I think it is the biggest. It's an amazing place, amazing people.
Okay, you got a couple of very serious questions, which, okay, are you ready? I'm going to read slowly. This is from Sarah Tedeschi.
Yes. Hi, Sarah.
Tedeschi, thank you. Sorry, Sarah, for my butchered pronunciation there. It sounds like, Stephen Wise and his efforts to litigate on behalf of individual animals, which is a new approach and paradigm to policy around animal welfare. Do you think we as human animals have the ability to raise these non-human animals to our own legal status? Can you comment on the potential of his efforts? Sorry, this is not a literary question so much, though I'm really excited you have taken this up in your work, and I cannot wait to read Personhood, Kiss, Snuggle.
It's a good question, and I don't actually have an answer. I mean, I think what's interesting to me is the history of habeas corpus in particular, and the body involved, and the confinement involved. So, as the story of who has habeas corpus standing expands, it's fascinating to try to expand that toward animals. I have in the piece, when you read the piece, you'll hear, because I always try to include very dialectical voices. There are people in the piece who are arguing against, well, what's going to happen? Our meat is going to have the right to, not be confined in the refrigerator. Like, what I mean? We don't want to, the point of absurdity is not where we want to go. But I think that his approach has changed the story. And that's why I'm particularly interested. We have to consider the personhood, the legal standing of animals who are autonomous, suffering, beings removed from their world and incarcerated. I think that this narrative of that is different than we're used to thinking of, certainly around zoos and, the places where they're held. Often in, Kiko, another famous case that Steve took on is a chimpanzee. These are our closest relatives. So, I mean, I don't think he's, at the moment, we're not talking about mollusks. Although I would hope he would include lobsters at the supermarket, because I can't go in any supermarket where they have that. I
have a feeling octopuses might be spared a little bit after that documentary with that man swimming around bonding with the octopus.
Right. I'm not a legal scholar. I don't know where it's going. I think the concept of habeas corpus is very useful to have in this fight for animal rights. And that's pretty much where my interests there were. I don't want to go too far in speaking where I don't know. Thanks. What's another question?
The next question is from a person called Laurel. Earlier in the conversation, I heard you say you are interested in language rather than ideas. Did I misunderstand? What I love about your work. Sorry, I have to redo that. I'm trying to get Laurel's voice here. What I love about your work and loved about being your student, lucky Laurel, is the emphasis you place on both. Have I gotten it wrong? Could you speak on this for a moment? I actually think that wasn't quite what you said, though. Sorry.
No.
Yeah.
I'm more interested in how we embody ideas.
Yeah.
Like we act them out. So what I'm interested in actually an idea I don't think of ideas as just a thing that's abstract. I think we actually live them out in our actions. And so what I'm interested in is how ideas become actions. If you believe something, well, then you can see it in how someone behaves. So that was very true in the Claude Bernard book, for example, Experimental Animals, because he had an entire narrative in his mind about why he could do vivisection so that he couldn't hear. He literally could be an actor who changed his senses, his sensibility, because of a story he was telling, he believed about himself. So and yet his ideas have led to that moment. So it's more I'm interested in how ideas are embodied in our stories, not that they're not there. No, they're very much there. I think
as well, what I understood from what you were saying, and my potassium is a bit low at the moment, so that is a factor, but was that you're not interested in writing like a manifesto about animal rights.
No.
What you're interested in is creating new narrative forms that make us as readers think about these things in different ways. And I want to go to the ludic for a moment, because the playfulness in your work is something I really, really love, because these are like serious, detrimental, catastrophic things that you're writing about. Does that come back to theater? Is that kind of comedic, because there's a real kind of call and repeat throughout some of these pieces. I mean, the humor from the piece we just read about this bramble rolling onto the stage. So I'm kind of curious about that. Where did that come from?
Well, I mean, it's funny. I just personally have always thought that, like, when you look at Charlie Chaplin or the history of clowning or Beckett, that if you don't have the humor, yes, I'm not interested in writing a manifesto. I'm not interested in that, because it's really the absurdity of how our ideas trap us. It's the comedy of the trap. That's where I'm actually interested in. And then once you are stuck there and you start to untangle it, then you exhaust it, then it becomes, okay, but you have to, but there's also ideas which I want to call out a little, which is that the comedic, it's very anti-authoritative, right? The comedic is where we don't have to be right or have the right morals or do what we should. The comedic is already an element of chaos in a certain way. And the comedic, as some essay about how the comedic is actually essentially biological, because the comedy, you spend a day in the garden, it's one funny thing after the next. I mean, it's kind of true, and I think that's the relationship. The real relationship is not about morality. It's not about shoulds. It's not about religion. It's not about the stories we have. It's about a kind of pleasure and comedy of life. And so I try to really, I do naturally. I just want to live in that, because then I feel like I get to the story and I can start to tear it apart, but it's not that awful manifesto-like shrill.
Something very comedic has just happened. You have disappeared. And I think I can't see because my eyesight's too old, but I think it's a squirrel or something is on the screen. Can you turn your camera back on? Hello, Thalia, are you there? Okay, everybody. Something happened. We interrupt this program. Thalia will be coming back. She's just reconnecting. So in the meantime, I'd like
to... Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can't see you. I can't see you, but there you are. You're back. I was just letting my fern do a little dance.
Sorry. I have no idea what happened. Sorry.
But luckily my fern, my boyfriend, was ready to step in like every good patriarchal male.
You want to ask another question? I just want to make sure if people, I rarely do this, so if there are any questions.
Hold on. Yeah, we just lost you. You disappeared entirely, but you're back. Hold on. All right. Okay, we dealt with Laurel. I hope you're happy, Laurel. We don't want to disappoint. When we've destroyed our planet and our numbers dwindle, what animal will build zoos for us and sell tickets for our viewing? This is from Ishrat Syed. Forgive my pronunciation. Ishrat.
I think we should start placing bets now, because there's people who have their bets on the ants. There's people who have their bets on the flies. There's people who have bets on the lichen or the mushrooms. I don't know, but it will be. I have no sentimentality about the fact that humans will go away and amazing new things will happen. So
maybe the dinosaurs will reemerge.
Maybe.
I'd like to see the woolly mammoth come back. I think it was a great.
I have a piece in Bird Lover's Backyard. There's a piece about the woolly mammoth coming back. So if you're interested in that, my thoughts on that.
I love woolly mammoths. Kaya, sorry, I got a little shocked when you disappeared.
Sorry, I'm here.
It's okay, because it just reminded me of this fern. And the reason why I have this affection for ferns is because I read Oliver Sacks' book about ferns called Oaxaca Journal. And I bring this up because I used to think that ferns were kind of like useless. I thought they were kind of ugly things, and I didn't understand why there were just so many of them everywhere. And then I read his Oaxaca Journal about all those people going ferning in Mexico, and suddenly discovered, oh no, this is like this prehistoric wonder. And so I'm curious about what books like you've read in that realm. Like, I know you've been interested in animal rights, obviously, for 8 books, basically, more or less, 3 particular. But I'm just curious, like, what books, if any, like Coetzee, what did you make of his, brief interludes there? He had 3 books where he talked about the lives of animals, right?
Yeah, I think he's done. Similarly, I have a lot of respect for the way he's trying to use narrative to change the way we see the story. So I very much appreciate what he's doing. I have an esoteric history with literature. I probably have nothing much to say. I mean, Brecht and Piscator are more influential to me than almost anyone else. Like I come from a world in which how to use research, how to use what we learn is as important to me as other kinds of literary conversations. So
you don't enjoy reading books about people?
I do. By the time I teach and write, I do read, but I didn't really grow up as a reader, so I love to read, and when I get to do it, I think, why don't I do this all the time? But it's really partly because I do so much of writing. I really am reading for my research, and that takes me out of reading for pleasure, kind of.
I think that
although books like Citizen, I've been very interested in how authors have been using the news. That, again, to go back to Brecht and Piscator, I'm very interested in a kind of contemporary emphasis on how to use a kind of activism through literature that uses because I'm interested in how that changes the storytelling.
Right. Yeah.
So even something like Kamau Brathwaite's Trenchtown Rock, that was a very influential book to me because of how playful it was, how theatrical it was. When I was first really reading books, it was like, wow, a revelation. Like, here's somebody theatricalizing what they're doing. Kind of the same with Stein. And a lot of Virginia Woolf, Three Guineas, the kind of thoughtfulness that Virginia Woolf puts into her Three Guineas, for example, that book blew my mind. So these, I'm sure I have a very esoteric pantheon. Anyway, what's another question?
There are no more questions, darling. You're stuck.
Okay. I'm stuck with you. Oh my God. But I think
me fern and my periodic table. That's all.
Well, maybe that's all people want to hear about us then.
Anybody got any more questions? Good book. Thank you both for a wonderful event. Brenda Shaughnessy's The Octopus Museum, Supremacy of Octopuses and Co.
Yes.
All right. Yeah, I wouldn't mind being ruled by octopuses. I was very impressed with that octopus. Imagine having like all of those things on your arms, and all of the brains. Those, what are they called? Those suction cups. Yeah, I'm never going to eat another octopus. Anybody else got another question for the lovely Thalia Field? This is a very rare appearance. She doesn't, we don't get her out much, but here she is. In terms of France, I'm kind of curious about that, like, because the stream is in France, right? What took you to France?
Oh, I went to France as a teenager.
Okay.
So I have a long history in France. But I think we should say goodnight because I'm worried we're just going to bore people.
Okay.
we should
now we're back.
Thank you both so much for such a great event. If you haven't bought the book yet, there's the little green buy the book tab. And also if anyone wants to rewatch this, so much to see, it'll be on our Crowdcast page immediately afterwards, and we'll also get it up on YouTube in a couple days. So thank you both and have a good night.
Thank you everyone.